Less than 24 hours after trying to undo the damage of his Helsinki press conference with Vladimir Putin, President Trump once again this morning is going after his critics, tweeting earlier, "Some people hate the fact that I got along well with President Putin of Russia. They would rather go to war than see this." It's called Trump derangement syndrome. Interesting to note that on Fox and Friends, a short time before he wrote that tweet, one of the contributors there, or a panelist, made that exact same point, and the president seems to have recharacterized it and put it into his own words on Twitter. Meanwhile, Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire is calling for a congressional hearing into President Trump's meeting with Putin. She tweeted that she wants the U.S. interpreter who was present for that meeting to uncover what Trump and Putin discussed privately. Shaheen saying, quote, "This interpreter can help determine what the president shared or promised Putin on our behalf." At the same time, several top Senate Democrats have sent a letter to President Trump demanding details about what he discussed with Putin during their private meeting. Joining us now from Capitol Hill, the ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Senator, it's good to have you with us this morning. You are one of those senators who's expressed concern about what happened in the 2+ hours that President Trump was alone, only with interpreters, and Vladimir Putin. Do you suspect you'll be able to get to the bottom of what exactly was said in that room, and if so, how?
Well, we're going to do everything we can to do it, and that starts next week when our calls to have Secretary Pompeo come before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was abided to. He'll be before us next Wednesday, and we will drive all of the questions not only in the time frame that he shared in the bilateral meeting, but what briefings did he get, what notes did he get from the 2 hours that President Trump met with Putin alone. And then we're still going to go after all other documentation. We want the interpreter to come before the committee. We want to see the notes. We're going to have a massive effort to try to get to what happened, because already Russian military are saying that they're ready to execute the agreements that President Trump entered into with President Putin. We have no idea what that is.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you have any idea what that is? And you just answered your own question. We thought it might have had something to do with the proposal that President Trump called a, quote, incredible offer, that Putin would allow Bob Mueller and his team into Russia if the Russian team would come and interview intelligence officials here in the United States. As you know, it's unusual for a president to go alone into a room with a foreign leader. President Trump has made it his habit. He did it in Singapore with Kim Jong-un as well. Do you have any clue, any suspicions as to why he wanted to be alone with President Putin and not have Mike Pompeo or John Bolton or someone in the room with him?
Well, look, it seems to me rather clear that what we saw, instead of America first, we saw Russia first at that press conference. I don't know whether we'll see from the special counsel whether there was collusion in 2016, but for me, there was collusion that day at that press conference. We saw a supplicant American president basically, laying blame at U.S. intelligence and law enforcement entities and embracing Putin's strong denial. And the only thing that's incredible about the offer made by Putin is that we would actually allow those who committed the crime to participate in the end of the day of investigating. It's so surreal, but more importantly, it's so outrageous.
Senator, you're demanding details of this private meeting. Well, there's only one person who was there, which is the interpreter. So how likely is it that you're going to get Republicans to join you in calling for that interpreter to come forward? I know Senator Corker has been a strong partner in all of this, trying to get Pompeo for weeks to come and testify as well on North Korea, and he had also authored some sanctions legislation. Do you see Republicans joining that call to get that interpreter in to talk to members?
Well, it's time for my Republican colleagues to show that we can be patriots and not just partisans, that they have not been totally co-opted by President Trump as the Rasputin of the Republican Party. If President Obama had done this, I'd be peeling them off the ceilings. So I expect that they will join us in terms of protecting and defending the Constitution of the United States and our national interests and our national security and our elections. elections by making sure that we know everything that transpired. I have no idea of what he agreed. Did he agree to loosen up on CAATSA sanctions against Russia? Did he agree not to have, exercises with NATO? Did he agree to give away Crimea and Ukraine? I have no idea what he agreed to, and we need to know. We cannot be blindsided. Evidently, the Russian military and intelligence entities know what was agreed to.
Senator, the president was asked last night to explain why his son should be sent to fight and possibly die for the sake of Montenegro, which is going through NATO ascension process. The president responded by saying, I understand that question. I've asked it myself, not explaining the extent to which America has obligations overseas. The post-Atlantic consensus seems to be ebbing in the Republican Party, but you can't say that this is a Republican issue alone. Barack Obama spent 6 of his 8 years trying to pivot to Asia, withdrawing troops from the continent. The very last tank was withdrawn from Europe in 2013, only to be resent in 2014 when Russia invaded and annexed territory in Europe. If the post-Atlantic consensus is failing, and it is a bipartisan problem, can you blame Europe for saying that we need to go our own way, as Germany has said we can't rely on the White House? Can you blame Europe for trying to take over its own interests? And does the Democratic Party have an obligation to withdraw its approach in the Obama era towards Europe and to recommit to American internationalism and Atlanticism?
Well, that's a long question. Let me just simply say I don't accept the premise of your question. First of all, Democrats have strongly stood for NATO. We have stood for the proposition of Article 5 and mutual defense, the only time in its 73-year history that NATO has invoked Article 5 was actually on behalf of the United States after September 11th. Whether or not a country enters into NATO is always a question of whether they can meet the standards, but once they do, we have always embraced their entrance into NATO. And so, undermining the Article 5 provisions of mutual self-defense by picking and choosing which country within NATO you want to support undermines the whole transatlantic alliance and our security architecture.
But Senator Barack Obama did not support ascension for countries like Georgia and Ukraine.
Well, look, whether he supported sanctions for Georgia and Ukraine is not a question of whether or not that's NATO accession, which I thought was your question. As it relates to sanctions,
that's what I said, ascension, not sanctions.
Yeah, as it relates to sanctions, let me just say the Congress, in a bipartisan way, has spoken overwhelmingly strongly. And so, whether that's on Iran, whether that's on Russia, whether that's on North Korea, we have spoken incredibly strongly. And so I think that 98-2 vote is an expression of where Democrats are at.
Senator, this is Gene Robinson. You've been in the Senate for a while. You know your Republican colleagues. You talk to them senator to senator in a way that you guys don't speak publicly. What is the deal? Why are they serious? The Republicans who have taken strong national security positions for years, for decades, and who will occasionally, as Monday, come out with a statement saying this is wrong, this is awful, but who won't do anything, who won't take any action in a closely divided Senate where one vote can make the difference. They won't do anything to constrain this president. What is the deal? What are they afraid of him? What's the deal?
Gene, I think as I listen to the private conversations with my colleagues, particularly many who I have worked with on national security questions, on sanctions policy, on Iran, on Russia, on North Korea, on dealing with other questions in the world, who I have a great deal of respect for their positions in those regard, their silence is deafening at this point. And I think that the answer is I will hate to say it, many of them, I won't say all of them, but many of them are concerned that they believe that the president can have an electoral difference in their states, and that is muting what clearly in private is a significant discontent. But as I have said to several of them, there comes a moment in our lives, and I've been in the Congress 26 years between the House and the Senate doing foreign policy in both houses. I have never seen a day of infamy in terms of foreign policy policy like I saw the other day with Trump and Putin. And there's a moment in which you're called upon to be a patriot and not a partisan. I hope they rise to their better angels in that regard. There are things that we can actually do to send the world a message. First, protect our elections. Get all of the evidence as to what transpired in those meetings. Make sure that Russia sanctions are not only enforced that exist, but consider a new round of them. These would be clear signs. And protect the special counsel because, from a foreign soil, you have the President of the United States undermining his own Department of Justice.
All right, Senator Bob Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey. Senator, thanks for your time as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Gene Robinson asking the central question of our times. What is the deal? More an existential question.
It is.
Up next, the drama we've seen over the past week. You couldn't write the stuff, but our next guest could. Best-selling author Daniel Silva joins us next with his new novel, Incredibly Appropriate.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.